My eldest son, who works for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, called me at midnight. Shut everything down. Turn off the lights and go to the basement. And do not tell your son-in-law. I told him he was scaring me. He just said, do it. I did exactly what he said. And through the basement window I saw something that made my blood run cold. My name is Richard Callahan. I am 70 years old, and I spent my entire adult life building a logistics and transport empire from a single rusty truck into a nationwide fleet. I always believed my retirement would be peaceful, spent in the sprawling estate I bought for my late wife, Barbara. I thought I was safe. But before I tell you how my own home became a trap, tell me in the comments where you are watching this video from and what time it is there right now. It means the world to me to know who is listening. And if you have ever had to trust your gut when everything around you felt wrong, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It was exactly 12:05 in the morning on a Tuesday. The digital clock on my nightstand glowed faintly in the otherwise pitch-black room. The estate was perfectly still. I was lying in bed wide awake. Ever since Barbara passed away 4 years ago from a sudden illness, the nights have always been the hardest part of the day. This house is 10,000 square feet of empty space and echoes when you are alone. I was just staring at the ceiling thinking about old freight manifests, corporate acquisitions, and the shipping routes I used to manage, letting my mind wander to exhaust itself. But that quiet isolation was shattered by a sharp, jarring ring. It was not my cell phone. It was the secure analog landline I keep tucked away inside the drawer of my nightstand. Only one person in the entire world has that number, and he only uses it for absolute life or death emergencies. My eldest son, David. David is 42 years old. He is a senior agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specializing in the cybercrime and money laundering division. He is a man who has raided cartel compounds, interrogated international hackers, and dismantled criminal syndicates across borders. He is stoic, hardened by years of seeing the worst of humanity, and absolutely fearless. I have never in his entire life heard him sound panicked. Not when he broke his arm as a young boy, and not when he went through the grueling trials of the academy. But when I picked up that heavy plastic receiver and pressed it to my ear, his breathing was ragged and shallow. Dad listened to me very carefully. His voice was a harsh, breathless whisper that sent an immediate shiver down my spine. Do exactly what I say. Shut everything down. Turn off the lights and go to the basement right now. I sat up straight, the heavy blanket falling to my waist. My heart was suddenly hammering against my ribs, pumping a sudden rush of adrenaline through my veins. David, what is going on? You are scaring me, I said, trying desperately to keep my own voice steady and calm. He cut me off immediately. Just do it, Dad. Get to the basement. Do not turn on any lights. And whatever you do, do not tell Victor. Do not let Victor see you. Just hide. I felt a cold chill wash over my entire body, freezing the blood in my veins. Victor is my son-in-law. He is married to my sweet, trusting daughter, Emily. They have been living in the guest wing of my estate for the past 6 months, after a terrible fire ruined their suburban home. Victor is the chief executive officer of a cybersecurity startup. He is a smooth-talking, polite, impeccably dressed man who always seemed like the perfect supportive addition to our family. He brings me coffee in the mornings. He helps Emily with the groceries. Why on earth would David, an experienced federal agent, tell me to hide from my own son-in-law in the middle of the night? I did not ask any more questions. When a man who hunts monsters for a living tells you to hide, you do not hesitate. I hung up the phone with a soft click. My decades in the cutthroat logistics business taught me one thing above all else. When a crisis hits you, move first and ask questions later. Hesitation gets you killed. I opened the bottom drawer of my nightstand, and my hand wrapped around the cold, heavy steel of my .38 caliber revolver. I have kept it fully loaded and perfectly maintained ever since Barbara died. I pulled back the covers and placed my bare feet on the chilly hardwood floor. Getting to the basement was not going to be a simple task. When Victor and Emily moved in, Victor insisted on upgrading the house out of the goodness of his heart. He installed a state-of-the-art smart home security system, supposedly to keep me safe in my old age. There were highly sensitive motion sensors in the hallways, smart bulbs that triggered automatically with movement, and high-definition cameras that fed directly to a massive private server he kept locked in his wing. But I am not a clueless old man. I ran an empire that crossed international borders. I know how to spot a blind spot in any system. Victor assumed I did not understand modern technology, but I had spent weeks quietly mapping out the exact coverage of his sensors just out of sheer habit. I knew there was a 2-foot gap along the baseboards in the main corridor where the motion detectors could not sweep. I gripped my revolver tightly and dropped down to my hands and knees. At 70 years old, my joints ache with severe arthritis, and the cold floor sent sharp, stinging pains shooting up my spine and shoulders. But adrenaline is a powerful thing. It flooded my system, drowning out the pain entirely. I crawled slowly, silently, keeping my back firmly pressed against the plaster wall, inching my way down the long, dark hallway. I could hear my own breathing, loud and harsh in the absolute quiet of the house. I passed the guest wing where Emily and Victor slept. The heavy oak door was closed tight. There was no sound coming from inside. I reached the top of the main grand staircase. I knew exactly which wooden steps creaked from decades of walking up and down them, so I carefully placed my weight on the extreme outer edges, hugging the smooth wooden banister tightly. Step by cautious step, shadow by shadow, I descended to the first floor. The grand foyer was bathed in pale moonlight, filtering through the high arching windows. I stayed completely out of the light, moving like a ghost through the formal dining room and into the back kitchen hallway. The door to the basement was at the very end, tucked behind the pantry. I gripped the brass doorknob, turned it painfully slow to avoid the loud click of the metal latch, and slipped inside. I pulled the solid door shut behind me, plunging myself into total, suffocating darkness. The air down here was much cooler, smelling heavily of damp concrete and old dust. I carefully navigated the wooden stairs leading down into the subterranean level. The basement of this mansion is massive, reinforced with thick concrete walls designed to withstand tornadoes. It is a true fortress. I found a dark corner behind the large metal water boiler and crouched down on the floor, pulling my knees to my chest, gripping the revolver with both hands. I sat there in the pitch black, my mind racing, a mile a minute. What was happening above me? Why had David called me on the secure line? Why did he sound so genuinely terrified for my life? And why, above all else, did I need to hide from Victor? What could possibly connect my quiet, well-dressed son-in-law to the kind of extreme danger that makes a federal agent panic in the dead of night? I thought about my daughter. Emily is 34 years old, kind-hearted, and fiercely loyal to her husband. She loves Victor blindly. If there was severe danger inside this house, she was sleeping right next to it. Every protective instinct I had as a father screamed at me to run back up those stairs, to kick their bedroom door down, to drag my daughter and my grandson out of that bed and get them far away to safety. But I remembered the absolute dread in David's voice. Do not let Victor see you. David knows things I do not. He has intelligence resources I do not have access to. If I compromised his direct instructions, I could be putting Emily in even more danger. So I forced myself to stay completely still. I forced myself to breathe slowly in through my nose, out through my mouth, slowing my racing heart and steadying my shaking hands. The extreme cold from the concrete floor seeped through my thin pajama pants, but I did not dare move to get a blanket or a jacket. I gripped the textured handle of the .38 revolver so tightly my knuckles ached with the strain. I have faced down ruthless corporate rivals, navigated vicious labor strikes, and survived the darkest, most agonizing days of grief when I buried my wife. I have lived a long, hard, unapologetic life, but nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for the sheer, suffocating terror of hiding in my own basement, like a hunted animal waiting for a monster I could not yet see or understand. I looked up toward the ceiling, where a small rectangular ventilation window sat exactly at ground level. It was covered by a thin layer of dirt, and a sheer curtain showing only a tiny sliver of silver moonlight from the sprawling front lawn above. I had absolutely no idea that in just a few agonizing moments, I was going to look through that dirty glass window and witness the total violent destruction of everything I thought I knew about my family. I pushed myself up from the cold concrete floor, my joints popping softly in the quiet dampness of the basement. I moved toward the small ventilation window with agonizing care. The glass was caked with years of dust and cobwebs, but by pressing my face close to the pane, I had a clear ground-level view of the expansive circular driveway and the manicured front lawn. The moonlight cast long, pale shadows across the grass. Everything appeared completely still, just a quiet suburban night in a wealthy neighborhood. But then the shadows began to move. 3 massive jet-black sport utility vehicles rolled silently up the long driveway. Their headlights were completely turned off. They moved with a predatory stealth tires crunching softly against the gravel, parking in a tight, tactical formation right in front of the main portico. These were not the vehicles of local thieves or random home invaders. They were heavy armored and purposeful. The engines cut off simultaneously. The sheer coordination of their arrival sent a fresh wave of ice water through my veins. My grip on the .38 caliber revolver tightened until my fingers ached. The heavy doors of the vehicles opened in unison. 6 men stepped out into the cool night air. I held my breath watching them move. They were dressed in dark, unbranded tactical gear, their faces obscured by black fabric masks. They moved with absolute terrifying precision. There was no whispering, no hesitation, no nervous energy. These men were professionals. As they fanned out across the driveway, securing the perimeter, I saw the dull gleam of moonlight catching on the metallic surfaces in their hands. They were carrying modern compact rifles, and every single one of those weapons was fitted with a long, heavy suppressor. This was a hit squad, a highly trained, heavily armed cartel execution team standing right on my front lawn. My mind raced, trying to comprehend the sheer scale of the danger. I thought of Emily sleeping completely unaware in the guest wing. I imagined these ruthless killers breaking down the heavy oak front doors, sweeping through the house, destroying everything in their path. Every protective instinct I possessed screamed at me to fire my revolver through the glass to make noise, to draw their attention away from my daughter and grandson. I raised the barrel of my gun toward the window. But before I could make a sound, the massive custom-built front doors of my estate swung open smoothly. The heavy oak panels were not kicked in. They were not breached by a battering ram. Someone from inside the house had simply unlocked them and pulled them open. The warm yellow light from the grand foyer spilled out onto the stone steps of the portico, illuminating the driveway. I squinted through the dusty glass, expecting to see Emily standing there in a panic, or perhaps the hitmen dragging a hostage out into the open. Instead, a single figure stepped out of the light and onto the stone porch. He was wearing dark slacks and a casual, expensive cashmere sweater, looking as relaxed as a man stepping out to pick up the morning newspaper. It was Victor, my perfect, supportive cybersecurity executive son-in-law. My breath caught in my throat. I watched, completely paralyzed by shock, as Victor casually walked down the stone steps with his hands resting easily in his pockets. He did not look surprised. He did not look terrified. He looked entirely in control. The 6 armed killers did not raise their weapons at him. They did not shout commands. Instead, they lowered their suppressed rifles, standing at ease as Victor approached the man who appeared to be their leader. Victor smiled. It was the exact same charming, disarming smile he used when he asked Emily to marry him. The same smile he gave me every morning when he poured my coffee. He reached out, and the leader of the cartel, Hit Squad, grasped his hand in a firm, familiar handshake. They spoke quietly in the driveway, their voices too low for me to hear through the thick basement window. But I did not need to hear the words to understand the horrifying reality of the situation. Victor knew these men. He had invited them here. The security system he had so graciously installed for my protection had been completely disabled by his own hand to allow this armed squad onto the property without triggering a single alarm. My blood ran absolutely cold. The conversation on the driveway lasted only a few moments. Then the leader nodded and gestured toward the massive structure of the estate. Victor turned around, standing side by side with the armed killers. He raised his right arm and pointed deliberately upward. I followed the trajectory of his finger. He was pointing directly at the second floor. He was pointing exactly at the large bay windows of my master bedroom, the room where I had been sleeping just 15 minutes ago. The room where I would have been trapped completely vulnerable if David had not called me on that secure landline. Victor was giving them the exact location of his target. He was sending a cartel execution squad to murder his own father-in-law in cold blood. The realization hit me with the physical force of a sledgehammer. My knees buckled slightly, and I had to lean my shoulder against the damp concrete wall to keep from collapsing. All the air was sucked out of my lungs. For 6 months, I had welcomed this man into my home. I had fed him at my table. I had trusted him with the safety of my daughter and my innocent grandson. I had believed every single lie he told me. I thought back to this fire that had supposedly destroyed their suburban home, forcing them to move into my estate. Was that an accident? Or was it a calculated move to infiltrate my life, my property, and my finances? I thought of the heavy server racks he brought into the house, the odd hours, the late-night phone calls in fluent Spanish. Every piece of the puzzle suddenly snapped together in my mind, forming a picture of deception so profound, so meticulously planned, that it made my stomach churn with physical nausea. Victor was not a victim of bad luck. He was a predator, a parasite who had woven himself into the very fabric of my family. And now he was orchestrating my execution. Outside, Victor stepped aside, holding his hand out toward the open front door in a welcoming gesture. The leader of the hit squad signaled his men. 4 of the heavily armed killers jogged silently up the stone steps, moving with lethal efficiency, crossing the threshold and entering my home. Victor and the leader followed closely behind them. The heavy oak doors closing softly, plunging the front lawn back into quiet darkness. I stood alone in the pitch-black basement, listening intently. I could hear the faint, muffled thuds of heavy tactical boots moving across the hardwood floors of the grand foyer directly above my head. They were heading for the main staircase. They were heading up to the second floor to my bedroom to put a bullet in the head of a sleeping old man. I pressed my back against the concrete wall, clutching the revolver to my chest. The sheer scale of the betrayal threatened to break my spirit. I was 70 years old, alone in the dark, hunted in a house I had built with my own hands. My daughter was upstairs, sleeping in the same house as a man who had just invited a death squad through the front door. The fear was suffocating, heavy and cold. But as I listened to those footsteps above me, a different emotion began to rise through the terror. It was an emotion I had not felt since the early days of building my logistics empire, back when rivals tried to crush my business and ruin my life. It was pure, unadulterated rage. A cold, focused fury that sharpened my senses and hardened my resolve. Victor had made a catastrophic miscalculation. He had assumed I was just a wealthy, soft old man resting comfortably in his retirement. He thought he could manipulate my love for my daughter, use my resources, and discard me like trash when I was no longer useful. But he did not know who he was dealing with. He did not understand the kind of ruthless survival instinct it takes to build a legacy from absolutely nothing. He had brought a war into my home. He had threatened the safety of my bloodline. And as I stood in the dark, listening to the killers search for me, I made a silent vow. Victor was not going to get my money. He was not going to inherit my estate. And he was certainly not going to walk away from this night with his life intact. The hunted was about to become the hunter, and I was going to tear his perfect, deceitful world completely apart. To understand how a man like Victor managed to embed himself so deeply into my life, you have to go back exactly 6 months. Before the cartel hitmen, before the hidden servers, before the unimaginable betrayal. Back then, I believed I was simply doing what any loving father would do. I was protecting my little girl. It was late October, a bitter and windy night that chilled you straight to the bone. I received a phone call around 2 in the morning. It was Emily. She was hysterical, coughing uncontrollably, barely able to form a coherent sentence. All I could make out through her panicked sobs was that their house was on fire. I threw on a jacket and drove my truck to their suburban neighborhood in record time, breaking every speed limit law in the county. When I arrived, the sky was thick with acrid black smoke that burned my throat. The flashing red and white lights of the fire engines illuminated the dark street in a chaotic rhythm. Their beautiful two-story colonial home was a hollow, smoldering shell. The roof had completely caved in, sending sparks flying into the night air. The intense heat radiating from the property was palpable even from 50 yards away. Emily was sitting on the back bumper of an ambulance, wrapped tightly in a thick thermal blanket, clutching my infant grandson Leo to her chest. She was trembling violently, her face streaked with dark soot and tears. Victor was standing right beside her, talking to the fire chief. His clothes were singed at the edges. His hands were black with ash, and he looked like a man who had just lost everything he had ever worked for. I ran straight to my daughter and wrapped my arms around her, pulling her and my grandson into a tight, desperate embrace. She buried her face into my shoulder and wept. Victor walked over to us a moment later, his shoulders slumped in utter defeat. He looked at me with eyes full of overwhelming despair. He told me that he woke up to the foul smell of burning plastic and immediately grabbed Emily and the baby. They barely made it out the back door before the lower floor was completely engulfed in raging flames. The fire chief walked over, wiping sweat from his brow, and gave us the preliminary assessment. He said it looked like a catastrophic failure in the main electrical panel located in the basement. A sudden power surge, a stray spark, and the old wiring caught the insulation. It was a tragic accident, the kind of random misfortune that destroys families every single day across the country. I looked back at Victor. He ran a trembling hand through his soot-covered hair and looked down at the concrete. He looked so incredibly vulnerable, so completely broken. He muttered about how he was supposed to protect his family, how he had lost all their savings in the renovations they had just completed, and how he had absolutely no idea where they were going to sleep that night. My heart broke for him. I saw a young father whose entire world had just burned to the ground. I did not see a monster. I saw a man in desperate need of a lifeline. I did not even have to think about my next move. I put a firm, reassuring hand on Victor's shoulder. I told him that they were family, and family always takes care of their own. I told them to pack whatever they could salvage, which was practically nothing, and get into my car immediately. My estate was massive. Since Barbara passed away, the 10,000 square feet of living space had felt like a silent museum of ghosts. I had an entire guest wing on the ground floor, complete with its own private entrance, 3 spacious bedrooms, a nursery, and a fully equipped small kitchen. It was beautifully furnished and sitting completely empty. I told Victor that they would move in with me that very night. They could stay for as long as they needed. 6 months, a year, however long it took to rebuild their lives, sort out the insurance claims, and get back on their feet. Emily cried harder, thanking me over and over again, her voice muffled against my chest. Victor looked up at me, his eyes shining with unshed tears. He gripped my hand with both of his, shaking it vigorously. He told me that he would never be able to repay my immense kindness. He swore right there in the smoke-filled street that he would be the best son-in-law a man could ever ask for. He promised to help maintain the estate, to pull his weight, and to make sure I never regretted taking them in during their darkest hour. I believed every single word that came out of his mouth. The transition into my home was entirely seamless. Within a week, they had settled into the guest wing and created a comfortable routine. And true to his word, Victor played the role of the perfect, devoted family man flawlessly. He was attentive, respectful, and incredibly helpful at every turn. He would wake up early every morning, long before the sun even crested the horizon, to brew a fresh pot of coffee. When I walked into the kitchen, he would always be there, dressed neatly in his business casual attire, ready to pour me a steaming cup and discuss the morning news with genuine interest. He cooked elaborate breakfasts for Emily, so she could rest and recover from the trauma. He played with little Leo on the living room rug, making the baby laugh until his cheeks turned bright red. He even took it upon himself to handle the heavy maintenance around the sprawling estate. He cleaned the high gutters, reorganized my messy garage, and fixed a leaking pipe in the guest bathroom before I even had the chance to call a professional plumber. He mowed the massive front lawn every weekend, without ever being asked, perfectly edging the borders. He took care of the tedious paperwork for the insurance company, shielding Emily from the stressful administrative burdens while she was busy healing. Whenever I tried to thank him or offer to pay for his hard labor, he would just give me that humble, disarming smile. He would insist that it was the absolute least he could do after I had saved his family from being out on the cold street. He presented himself as a hard-working, honest man who was merely trying to rebuild his shattered life from the ashes. I let my guard down completely. I welcomed him into my inner circle, sharing meals, stories from my logistics days, and the quiet moments of my lonely retirement. I genuinely thought I had gained a true son. I had absolutely no real idea that I had just invited a calculating, ruthless parasite directly into my sanctuary. He had orchestrated the fire to gain access to my life, and I had foolishly handed him the keys. Within 2 weeks, the guest wing had been completely transformed. I gave them total freedom to decorate the space however they saw fit. I wanted them to feel like it was their true home. It was during a quiet Sunday morning while Emily was upstairs nursing little Leo that Victor approached me in the main study. I was sitting in my leather armchair going over some old operational reports from my logistics company. Victor knocked softly on the open door frame, holding 2 mugs of freshly brewed dark roast coffee. He handed me one and sat down opposite my desk. He had a serious, thoughtful expression on his face, the kind a man gets when he is about to propose a major business venture. He took a slow sip of his coffee and looked around the study, his eyes lingering on the heavy oak bookshelves and the large wall safe tucked behind a framed painting. Then he leaned forward with his hands clasped together. He told me that he had been thinking heavily about our living arrangement. He said that while he could never truly repay me for taking his family in after the fire, he wanted to contribute something meaningful to the household. He explained that his cybersecurity startup had recently developed some highly advanced integration systems for residential properties. He wanted to personally install a state-of-the-art smart home security network across the entire estate completely out of his own pocket. I initially waved the idea off. I told him that the house was in a safe, gated community, and the old alarm system had worked perfectly fine for the past 2 decades. I did not want him spending his hard-earned money on something I did not strictly need. But Victor was remarkably persistent. His voice remained incredibly calm, smooth, and deeply persuasive. He looked me directly in the eyes, projecting absolute sincerity and professional concern. He told me that times had changed. He said criminals were no longer just breaking windows to steal televisions. They were targeting high-net-worth individuals looking for digital vulnerabilities, physical blind spots, and easy access to financial documents. Then he delivered his pitch with flawless execution. He said, "You have valuable assets, Richard. My cybersecurity firm can make this house impenetrable to hackers and thieves. I want to do this to protect you, Emily and Leo. Let me give you the gift of absolute peace of mind." It was the mention of my grandson that finally broke down my resistance. I knew next to nothing about digital security or modern residential surveillance. If my son-in-law felt that my home was vulnerable, who was I to argue? I nodded, slowly gave him my permission, and thanked him for his proactive dedication to our family. Victor smiled a wide, genuine-looking smile and immediately set to work. The very next morning, the transformation of my quiet estate began. A team of technicians arrived in unmarked white vans. For the next 5 days, my house felt like a construction zone. They ran miles of thick black cables through the walls, working with a quiet, practiced efficiency. Victor supervised every single detail of the operation. He walked around with a digital tablet, pointing out angles, checking sight lines, and directing the crew with absolute authority. The upgrades were extensive and undeniably impressive. The heavy brass keys I had used for 20 years were replaced by sleek, modern biometric locks on every exterior door. Now access required a thumbprint and a retina scan. Victor explained that this would prevent any physical lockpicking. He installed a highly intricate network of high-definition cameras throughout the property. There were lenses mounted under the eaves of the roof, discrete domes placed in the corners of the main hallways, and sleek cameras scanning the grand foyer. The image quality was astonishingly clear, but the centerpiece of his entire security operation was located inside the guest wing. They brought in a massive, heavy-duty private server rack. It took 4 men to wheel the towering black metal cabinet into the spare bedroom that Victor had converted into his home office. The server hummed with a low, constant vibration. Victor installed a dedicated cooling unit just to keep the machines running smoothly. He told me that this server would process all the encrypted video feeds, manage the biometric data, and serve as an impenetrable firewall against any external hacking attempts. He claimed it was military-grade hardware. I stood in the doorway of his new office watching the blinking green and blue lights of the server rack. It looked like the control room of a secure government facility right in the middle of my residential home. I asked him if all this heavy equipment was truly necessary for a single-family estate. He wanted to make absolutely certain that no external force could ever compromise the network. He handed me a sleek black key fob and a dedicated tablet. Emily was absolutely thrilled with the new system. That evening, as we sat together in the formal dining room, enjoying a roasted chicken dinner, she could not stop praising her husband. She reached across the table, grabbed Victor's hand, and looked at him with sheer adoration. She told me how incredibly lucky she felt to have a man who cared so deeply about her safety and the safety of our family. She recounted how terrifying the fire at their old house had been, how helpless she had felt watching their belongings burn, and how this new security system finally allowed her to sleep soundly through the night. She said Victor was her protector. I watched my daughter smile, a bright, genuine smile that erased the lingering shadows of the trauma she had endured. Seeing her that happy, that deeply comforted, completely validated the invasive nature of the installation process. I felt a profound sense of relief, knowing that they were finally safe and secure. I raised my glass of wine and proposed a toast to Victor, thanking him for his hard work, his generosity, and his unwavering commitment to our family. Victor raised his glass in return, accepting the praise with a modest downward glance, playing the role of the humble provider to absolute perfection. For the next several quiet weeks, the new system simply faded into the background of our daily lives. I learned to press my thumb against the glass panel to unlock the front door. I grew accustomed to the faint mechanical whir of the cameras adjusting their lenses as I walked down the main hallway. The blinking lights of the massive server in the guest wing simply became part of the house's heartbeat. I blindly accepted the lie completely. I believed that I was living in the safest, most secure environment possible. I believed that my son-in-law had fortified my walls against the dangers of the outside world. I had absolutely no idea that the real danger was not trying to break into my home. The danger had already unpacked its bags, set up a secure base of operations, and completely locked me inside a digital cage of its own design. The danger had already unpacked its bags, set up a secure base, and locked me inside a digital cage of its own design. For the first few weeks following the installation of the new security network, life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Emily was relaxed, the baby was happy, and Victor played the part of the dedicated entrepreneur. But my sleeping habits have never been sound. As a man who spent 40 years managing freight routes, I was accustomed to the disruptions of graveyard shift logistics. My internal clock often woke me long before dawn. It was during one of these restless hours around 3:00 that the first crack in Victor's facade began to show. I had left my bedroom to get water from the kitchen. The house was supposed to be silent, but as I walked past the corridor leading toward the guest wing, a rhythmic murmur caught my attention. I stopped pressing myself against the wall. The sound came directly from behind the heavy oak door of Victor's home office. I crept closer, placing my footsteps carefully. Through the heavy wood, I could hear Victor speaking. He was on the phone, his voice dropped to an urgent whisper. It was not the tone that sent a prickle of unease down my spine. It was the language. He was speaking in rapid, flawless, localized Spanish. I do not speak the language fluently, but decades of dealing with international shipping contractors gave me an ear for the cadence. Victor was not using the polished Spanish one might use in a boardroom. He was speaking with aggressive efficiency, issuing rapid numbers and demanding immediate confirmations. There was a commanding edge to his voice that contradicted the humble persona he presented at the dinner table. I stood there for a long time listening. When the call ended, I retreated to my bedroom, my mind buzzing. Why was the chief executive of a domestic cybersecurity startup taking aggressive Spanish phone calls at 3 in the morning? The late-night phone calls soon became a regular occurrence, a hidden pattern in the dark hours of the estate. But the truly alarming anomalies began to arrive in broad daylight. About a week after I first heard Victor on the phone, a commercial delivery truck pulled up to the main security gates. I happened to be standing on the front portico holding my morning coffee when the heavy engine grumbled to a halt. 2 delivery men stepped out, lowering the hydraulic lift gate. They began to unload 4 enormous reinforced wooden shipping crates. They were heavy, requiring industrial pallet jacks to maneuver them across the concrete. As a man who built a logistics empire, I know freight perfectly well. I know the exact difference between standard parcels and enterprise-level hardware. These crates were massive. They were stamped with international shipping manifests and dense barcodes that indicated extreme weight and high-value contents. Victor hurried out of the front door, looking flustered, moving quickly to direct the delivery men toward the side entrance of the guest wing. He signed the clipboard with agitated motions. I walked down the stone steps, my curiosity piqued, and approached the crates. I glanced at the shipping labels tacked to the raw wood. They were addressed to Victor's company, but the routing origins were complex, passing through several obscure transit hubs before arriving at my home. I asked the men to be careful, noting the heavy-duty shock sensors attached to the exterior. Those sensors are only used for highly sensitive, expensive server arrays. Victor thanked the men, tipping them generously, and guided the massive crates into the secure depths of his office wing. He closed the heavy doors behind them, sealing the equipment away. I stood on the driveway, feeling a deep sense of logistical confusion. A very small cybersecurity startup simply did not require that volume of raw enterprise-grade computing power. That evening, we sat together in the formal dining room for our usual family dinner. Emily was glowing, bouncing little Leo on her knee, blissfully unaware of the heavy silence I was harboring. Victor sat across from me, cutting his steak with precise movements. I decided to press the issue gently, keeping my tone casual, like a curious father taking an interest in his son-in-law's business. I took a slow sip of my red wine, set the glass down on the table, and looked directly across the expensive arrangements. I mentioned the massive delivery from that morning. I remarked that it looked like he was building a data center, rivaling a small tech campus inside the guest wing. I also casually noted that I had heard him awake at 3 in the morning, managing international calls. I asked him with a perfectly polite smile just how rapidly his startup was expanding to require such heavy logistics and late-night operations. Victor did not flinch. He did not drop his fork. He did not show a single flicker of panic. He simply dabbed his mouth with a linen napkin, leaned back in his chair, and offered me that same brilliant, disarming smile. His delivery was incredibly smooth, polished to an absolute shine. He told me that he had been meaning to share the fantastic news with the family. He claimed that his firm had just landed a monumental, multi-year server protection contract with a corporate conglomerate based in South America. He painted a detailed picture of a telecom giant looking to secure their regional data against cyber threats. It was a huge step for his company, a game changer that required him to scale up his hardware immediately. The heavy server crates were strictly necessary to handle the encrypted data traffic. As for the late-night phone calls, he chuckled softly, shaking his head. He explained that time zone differences and the demands of international clients meant he had to work odd hours. He even threw in a joke about brushing up on his business Spanish. Emily beamed with pride. She reached across the table and squeezed his hand, telling him how incredibly hard he worked and how proud she was of his success. She looked at me, her eyes shining with joy completely and totally sold on the narrative of the hard-working husband securing their future. I looked at Victor's calm, steady eyes. His explanation was technically flawless. It covered every discrepancy. It explained the servers, the language, the hours, and the influx of resources. It was a perfectly plausible, tightly constructed lie. Outwardly, I smiled. I raised my glass to him, offering my congratulations on landing such a prestigious contract. I told him how proud I was to have such a driven man taking care of my daughter and grandson. But internally, my logistics mind was cataloging the data. The routing labels on those crates had not originated from a telecom hub. The aggressive tone I heard in the hallway did not match the posture of a vendor speaking to a new client. I bought the surface explanation for Emily's sake, keeping the peace. But as I watched Victor sip his wine, I remained acutely observant, waiting for the absolute truth. It was 3 days after that dinner when my decades of logistical training finally broke through the illusion Victor had so carefully constructed. In the freight and shipping industry, your entire livelihood depends on identifying blind spots. You learn to look at a sprawling warehouse and immediately spot the bottlenecks, the areas where cargo could easily go missing. You train your eyes to see not what is there, but what is missing. For 40 years, I made my fortune by eliminating vulnerabilities. So when I finally decided to take a hard analytical look at the new security system Victor had installed, the discrepancies stood out like blazing sirens in the dead of night. It started on a crisp Tuesday morning. Emily had taken little Leo to a pediatrician appointment, and Victor was locked away inside his guest wing office, supposedly handling his new international telecom client. I decided to take a slow, deliberate walk around the entire perimeter of my estate, a cup of black coffee held firmly in my hand. I wanted to see the physical fortifications my son-in-law had built to protect us, but as I walked the expansive gravel driveway and inspected the thick perimeter walls, a deep, unsettling confusion began to take root in my analytical mind. The heavy wrought iron front gates had absolutely no camera coverage. There was a sleek black dome camera mounted near the garage, but its lens was angled sharply downward, focusing entirely on the internal walkway, leading to the guest wing rather than the street. I walked around to the back of the house where the property slopes down toward a thick line of old oak trees. It was a natural blind spot, a perfect approach vector for anyone looking to trespass undetected. Yet, there were no motion sensors there. There were no floodlights. The entire external perimeter of my 10,000-square-foot home was woefully, almost deliberately exposed. I stepped back inside through the kitchen, my brow furrowed in concentration. If the external cameras were not pointing at the vulnerable entry points, what exactly were they looking at? I traced the wiring pathways along the baseboards, following the digital trail. I walked down the main corridor, stopping directly beneath one of the new high-definition lenses. The camera was not sweeping the hallway to detect movement from the windows. It was fixed entirely on the door of my personal study. I slowly turned the heavy brass knob and stepped into my office. This room was my private sanctuary. It was where I kept all the sensitive legal documents, the corporate charters, and the controlling shares for Callahan Logistics. I had semi-retired, stepping away from the daily operations, but my signature and my authorization were still legally required for any major corporate restructuring or massive financial transfer. I walked over to my heavy mahogany desk and looked up. Tucked discreetly into the shadows of the vaulted ceiling was another camera. I followed its line of sight. It was perfectly angled to capture a clear, unobstructed view of my desk surface. It could easily read the keystrokes on my computer keyboard or the text of any document I laid out to sign. My heart began to beat with a slow, heavy rhythm. I turned around and looked at the opposite wall. There was a beautiful antique oil painting of a maritime harbor hanging there, a piece Barbara and I had purchased on a trip to Boston decades ago. Hidden directly behind that painting was my personal wall safe. Inside that safe were my passports, my physical stock certificates, emergency cash, and the master ledger containing the encrypted passwords for my banking portals. I took a step to my right. Hidden behind a tall potted fern was a third camera. Its lens was fixed squarely on the maritime painting. It was positioned perfectly to capture the exact combination I dialed into the safe keypad. I stood perfectly still in the center of my study, the warm morning sunlight filtering through the plantation shutters, feeling a bone-deep chill spread through my chest. These cameras were not installed to keep violent intruders out of my home. They were not designed to alert us to burglars or hackers trying to breach the estate from the outside world. The realization hit me with the devastating force of a physical blow. The perimeter was entirely undefended because Victor did not care about the perimeter. The threat was already inside the house. Victor had not built a fortress to protect my family. He had built an elaborate high-tech surveillance cage, and he had placed me squarely in the center of it. He was monitoring my every move. He was watching when I entered my office, documenting what files I opened, and recording the precise moments I accessed my private safe. The biometric locks on the doors were not there to keep thieves out. They were there to log exactly when I left the house and exactly when I returned, giving him a perfect, undeniable schedule of my daily routines. He needed to know exactly when I was looking, and more importantly, exactly when I was completely oblivious. My mind flashed back to the massive server crates delivered to the guest wing. A small cybersecurity firm did not need enterprise-grade hardware, but a man running a massive illegal financial operation, a man who needed to forge documents, bypass banking security, and route millions of dollars through hidden channels, would need exactly that kind of computing power. And he would need to do it under the roof of a wealthy, established, and unsuspected businessman. He was using my home network. He was using the legitimate, unblemished reputation of Callahan Logistics as a digital shield. The profound sense of betrayal threatened to suffocate me. This was the man who slept next to my daughter. This was the man holding my grandson. He had looked me directly in the eyes over a formal dinner and lied with the smooth, practiced ease of a complete sociopath. He had weaponized my love for Emily and my desire to protect my family, twisting my paternal instincts into a tool for his own malicious gain. I felt a sickening wave of revulsion, quickly followed by a sharp, metallic clarity. I did not confront him. I did not storm into the guest wing and demand answers. If I tipped my hand now, if I let him know that the clueless old man had figured out the game, he would destroy the evidence and possibly harm my daughter to save his own skin. Instead, I carefully backed out of my study, closing the heavy wooden door with a soft, deliberate click. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, and forced my facial muscles to relax into the gentle, unassuming expression of a happily retired grandfather. Victor wanted to play a game of shadows in my house, but he had fundamentally underestimated the man he was trying to replace. I was going to let him believe he was the smartest man in the room right up until the exact moment I trapped him in his own snare. 2 days after that dinner, as I was quietly processing the terrifying reality of the hidden cameras in my study, the absolute truth finally arrived. It did not come from Victor, and it did not come from my own amateur investigations. It came in the form of a highly irregular phone call from a man I had trusted with my corporate finances for over 3 decades. Thomas Weaver was a senior executive vice president at Chase Bank. We had built our respective careers in tandem, navigating the complex financial waters of corporate expansion and international shipping logistics. Thomas is a man who practically bleeds corporate protocol. He schedules meetings weeks in advance and conducts all his business within the pristine glass walls of his downtown corner office. So when my personal cell phone rang on a dreary Thursday morning and I saw his name flash across the screen, I fully expected a routine question about my semi-retirement trust funds. Instead, his voice sounded strained, dropping an octave lower than his usual booming baritone. He did not ask how I was doing. He simply asked if I could meet him for a discreet cup of coffee at a small diner located on the far outskirts of the city. He emphasized heavily that this was not a social call and that I should not mention our meeting to anyone. A cold, heavy knot formed deep in the pit of my stomach. When a senior commercial banker asks to meet a retired logistics magnate in a rundown, isolated diner, it means the kind of profound trouble that destroys family legacies. I put on a heavy wool coat, told Emily I was running errands, and drove my truck to the designated address. The diner was a quiet, unassuming place with fading leather booths and the bitter smell of stale coffee lingering in the air. I spotted Thomas sitting alone in a dim corner booth facing the main door. He was wearing a dark trench coat, his hands wrapped tightly around a chipped ceramic mug, as if trying to draw warmth from it. He looked unusually pale, his eyes darting nervously toward the entrance as I slid into the squeaky vinyl seat across from him. He did not offer a warm smile or a friendly handshake. He simply pulled a thick, unmarked manila envelope from his battered leather briefcase and slid it carefully across the sticky laminate table toward me. I kept my hands resting firmly on my lap, looking at the swollen envelope as if it were a live explosive device. I asked him what was going on and why he looked like a man about to face a military firing squad. Thomas leaned forward, keeping his voice down to a harsh, constrained whisper. He told me that he was putting his entire prestigious career and his personal freedom on the line just by sitting at this table with me today. He said that the highly sensitive compliance algorithms of the bank had flagged a series of highly irregular, massive transactions deeply embedded within the primary corporate accounts of Callahan Logistics. I frowned, feeling a strange mix of deep confusion and sudden defensiveness. I reminded him gently that I had stepped back from the daily operations of the company nearly 2 years ago. I told him that my appointed executive board handled all the routine domestic shipping contracts, and our financial growth had been completely stable and perfectly clean for 30 uninterrupted years. Thomas shook his head slowly, his eyes wide with a desperate kind of warning. He told me firmly these were absolutely not standard domestic shipping contracts. He tapped the thick manila envelope with a trembling index finger. He said that over the past 4 weeks, Callahan Logistics had been receiving massive multi-million-dollar wire transfers from a complex network of anonymous shell companies based out of Panama. The money was flooding into our secondary holding accounts in staggering, unprecedented volumes. But the most alarming part of the entire operation was not the origin of the illicit funds. It was the final destination. Thomas explained that the exact moment these massive sums cleared the domestic holding accounts, they were instantly and automatically bounced out again. The funds were not being used to purchase new freight trucks or acquire new shipping warehouses. The millions of stolen dollars were being systematically routed directly into completely untraceable, offshore cryptocurrency exchanges. These massive digital transfers were happening in the dead of the night, executed with rapid, automated precision, completely bypassing the standard operational hours of my entire corporate accounting staff. My heart slammed against my ribs with the brutal force of a physical blow. The air in the tiny diner suddenly felt incredibly thin, making it exceptionally difficult to draw a complete breath. I stared at Thomas, completely unable to comprehend the sheer, devastating magnitude of what he was telling me. I told him there had to be a massive banking glitch in their routing software. I stated firmly that I had not authorized a single one of those transfers, and my executive board would never approve routing corporate capital into anonymous digital currency. Thomas looked at me with a profound, terrifying sorrow. He whispered that there was absolutely no glitch in the system. He explained that these transfers were fully authorized. They were executed using my personal encrypted digital signature and the highest-level executive clearance codes assigned exclusively to me. As far as the global financial system was concerned, Richard Callahan was personally moving tens of millions of dollars of dark money across international borders. The internal fraud department of the bank was currently reviewing the critical flags. He warned me that it was only a matter of days before the federal authorities were formally notified, and an absolute avalanche of federal indictments would fall directly onto my head. The floor seemed to drop out from underneath me. The entire world seemed to tilt violently on its axis as a horrifying clarity washed over my mind. The strange puzzle pieces I had been collecting over the past few weeks slammed together with undeniable force. The late-night phone calls in fluent, aggressive Spanish. The massive enterprise-grade server crates delivered directly to the guest wing. The invasive cameras pointing directly at my wall safe and my computer keyboard. Victor had not been working on a legitimate contract for a South American telecom giant. He had been actively capturing my keystrokes. He had maliciously stolen my encrypted passwords, my digital signatures, and my highest executive banking clearances. He had intentionally turned the guest wing of my quiet, peaceful estate into a sophisticated, high-speed money laundering node. He was using the pristine reputation of Callahan Logistics as an impenetrable digital shield to wash millions of dollars for a ruthless cartel. He was perfectly hiding his atrocious crimes behind my honorable name. If the federal government raided this massive operation, they would inevitably find my digital signature on every single fraudulent transfer. Victor would simply pack his expensive bags, play the absolute role of the profoundly shocked, totally innocent son-in-law, and walk away completely clean, leaving me to rot in federal prison. The drive back to my estate was a surreal blur of gray asphalt and blinding afternoon sun. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned completely white, aching with the strain of suppressed fury. Every traffic light, every passing car felt distant, muted by the roaring blood rushing in my ears. Thomas had given me the final damning piece of the puzzle. The invisible cage Victor had built around me was not just for domestic surveillance. It was a perfectly constructed financial guillotine, primed and ready to drop on my neck the exact moment the federal authorities caught wind of the cartel money flowing through my corporate accounts. I pulled through the heavy iron gates of my property, watching them close slowly behind my truck. I parked in the circular driveway, taking several deep, measured breaths before cutting the engine. I could not storm into the house and demand answers. I could not show a single ounce of the profound rage that was currently burning a massive hole through my chest. Victor was a calculated predator. If he sensed even a fraction of my awareness, he would instantly trigger his contingency plans, wipe the offshore accounts, and disappear into the wind, leaving me holding the bag for $50 million in laundered cartel cash. I had to be smarter. I had to be colder. I needed to look him directly in the eyes and test his nerve. I needed to see the mask slip. I walked through the front doors, the biometric lock clicking softly as it accepted my thumbprint. The rich, savory aroma of roasted garlic and rosemary filled the grand foyer. Emily was in the vast kitchen humming a cheerful tune as she prepared a large family dinner. My sweet, trusting daughter completely oblivious to the fact that she was married to a monster. I greeted her with a warm smile, kissing her on the cheek, telling her how wonderful the house smelled. She beamed with pride, gesturing toward the formal dining room. Victor was already seated at the long mahogany table, typing furiously on his sleek silver laptop. He looked up as I entered, offering that same polished, sickeningly perfect smile. He asked how my errands went, his tone dripping with fake familial concern. I told him they were incredibly tedious, just the boring chores of a retired old man trying to fill his endless free time. I played the role to absolute perfection, letting my shoulders slump slightly, shuffling my feet just enough to project an image of harmless, fading age. I walked past him and deliberately left my cell phone inside the pocket of my heavy wool coat, draping the coat over a wooden chair in the adjacent hallway. The trap was officially set. We gathered around the dining table an hour later. The spread Emily had prepared was magnificent, but I could barely taste the food. Every bite of roasted chicken felt like dry sawdust in my mouth. I forced myself to chew, to smile, to ask Emily about little Leo and his recent pediatrician appointment. Victor sat to my immediate left, his silver laptop pushed slightly to the side but remaining completely open. The screen glowed brightly with complex spreadsheets and secure communication portals. He occasionally reached out with one hand to tap the spacebar, keeping the machine awake. a clear sign of a man terrified of losing a secure digital connection. The conversation flowed easily, filled with the mundane details of suburban life. Victor chimed in with a humorous anecdote about a difficult vendor, laughing warmly. He looked so incredibly comfortable, so thoroughly convinced that he was the absolute master of his domain. He thought he had completely won. He thought he had successfully hijacked my life without raising a single alarm. As the dinner slowly wound down, Emily stood up to clear the empty plates, humming softly as she carried the heavy porcelain dishes into the kitchen. Victor and I were left alone at the long table. He reached for his glass of red wine, his attention momentarily drifting toward the large bay windows. This was my moment. I let out a soft, exasperated sigh, patting my empty pockets with a convincing display of mild confusion. I muttered aloud that I was waiting for a highly important email from my golf club regarding a charity tournament and that I had foolishly left my phone in my coat in the other room. Before Victor could even process my words, I leaned across the polished mahogany table and reached my right hand directly toward his open, glowing laptop. I kept my voice incredibly casual, harmless, and completely mundane. "Let me just check my email real quick on your browser, Victor. It will only take a single second." My fingers were merely inches away from the silver keyboard when the atmosphere in the room violently exploded. Victor did not just pull the laptop away. He launched his entire body forward with the sheer, unfiltered panic of a wild animal stepping on a hidden bear trap. His heavy wooden chair shrieked terribly against the hardwood floor. He lunged across the table, his arms wrapping around the silver machine, violently snatching it away from my outstretched hand. The sudden aggressive movement caught the base of his crystal wine glass. The fragile glass tipped over, shattering loudly against the heavy mahogany table, sending a deep pool of dark red wine bleeding across the expensive white linen tablecloth. Victor slammed the laptop shut, with a loud, aggressive crack, clutching the device tightly to his chest, as if his very life depended on it. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving up and down. I looked directly into his eyes, and what I saw there was absolutely chilling. The charming, polite son-in-law was completely gone. The polished executive had vanished into thin air. Staring back at me was a cornered, terrified criminal. His pupils were blown wide, his jaw was clenched tight, and a visible sheen of cold sweat had instantly broken out across his forehead. He looked at me with pure, unadulterated venom. In that single, fleeting fraction of a second, the mask was entirely removed. The loud shattering of the glass brought Emily rushing back into the dining room, a look of deep concern plastered across her face. She gasped at the sight of the spilled wine and the broken crystal. Victor blinked rapidly, snapping back to his fabricated reality. He forced a loud, incredibly awkward laugh that echoed terribly in the tense room. He set the closed laptop safely on the chair behind him and immediately began to apologize, his voice pitching much higher than usual as he desperately tried to regain his composure. "Oh my goodness, Richard. I am so incredibly sorry. I did not mean to react like that." He grabbed a cloth napkin and began frantically dabbing at the spreading pool of red wine. "It is just that I have highly sensitive, strictly classified client documents open on the screen. It is a massive non-disclosure agreement for the new South American telecom contract. If anyone without authorized clearance even glances at those specific routing numbers, my firm could be sued for millions of dollars. It was just a pure automatic reflex to protect the client data. I am so sorry for the mess, really." Emily immediately rushed to his side, placing a comforting hand on his tense shoulder. She playfully scolded me, telling me that I should know better than to interrupt Victor when he is managing such critical corporate security tasks. She told me to go get my own phone from the hallway and let the poor man work in absolute peace. I slowly pulled my hand back across the table, my face locked into an expression of mild, apologetic surprise. I raised my hands in a placating gesture, offering a gentle, sheepish smile. I told him that I completely understood that I had dealt with strict corporate confidentiality for 40 years, and that it was entirely my fault for crossing a professional boundary. I apologized to Emily for causing a disruption, and smoothly excused myself to fetch my phone from my coat pocket. But as I walked away from the dining room, the smile instantly dropped from my face, replaced by a cold, hardened grimace. My heart was beating with a steady rhythmic drum of absolute terrifying certainty. Victor's violent, panicked reaction had confirmed every single word Thomas the banker had spoken. A man dealing with legitimate telecom routing data does not leap across a table as if a bomb is about to detonate. Only a man running a highly illegal, profoundly dangerous cartel money laundering operation reacts with that level of raw physical terror. He was terrified because if I had seen the screen, I would have seen the offshore cryptocurrency exchanges. I would have seen my own forged digital signatures authorizing the movement of millions of dollars of dirty money. My gut feeling had fully evolved into undeniable concrete reality. My son-in-law was a dangerous, calculating criminal who had weaponized my home, my family, and my entire legacy. The time for casual observation was completely over. It was time to start digging my own digital trenches, and it was time to prepare for absolute war. I knew fighting a cybersecurity expert on a digital battlefield was a guaranteed suicide mission. Victor held the high ground. He controlled the router, the encrypted network, and every megabyte of wireless data flowing through the estate. If I used my laptop to search for private investigators, if I used my smartphone to call my lawyer, or if I ordered counter-surveillance equipment using my own credit cards on the home network, Victor would instantly know about it before the transaction cleared. He had established a perfect digital perimeter. But Victor was a creature of the modern age. He relied exclusively on predictive algorithms, cloud storage, and wireless connectivity. He had severely underestimated the raw, untraceable power of old-fashioned analog tactics. As a man who built a vast logistics empire decades before the commercial internet, I knew exactly how to operate completely off the grid. I knew how to disappear in plain sight without leaving a trace of electronic evidence behind me. The next morning I announced at the breakfast table that I needed to take my classic car out for a maintenance drive. It was a perfectly normal, established routine for a semi-retired man on a sunny Friday afternoon. Victor smiled over his coffee and wished me a good trip, completely unaware that his invisible digital cage was about to be breached. I backed the heavy vehicle out of the spacious garage, feeling the deep vibration of the powerful engine beneath me. I deliberately did not connect my cell phone to the Bluetooth system. I drove steadily for over an hour, heading far out into the rural county limits, completely away from the upscale suburbs and familiar commercial districts. I finally pulled off the highway and coasted into a dusty truck stop that shared a cracked asphalt parking lot with an aging electronics supply store. It was exactly the kind of obscure, forgotten place that catered exclusively to long-haul, cross-country truckers and off-the-grid survivalist enthusiasts. It was a place situated completely outside the reach of Victor's corporate surveillance. I left my primary cellular phone securely locked inside the heavy metal glove compartment of my car. I walked into the dimly lit store, the stale smell of burnt coffee and electronic ozone hanging heavily in the quiet air. I bypassed the shiny displays of internet-connected smart devices and headed straight toward the back inventory aisle. I carefully selected a cheap, basic prepaid cellular phone that operated entirely on disposable minutes. Next, I methodically selected 3 standalone battery-powered analog pinhole cameras. These were incredibly simple, highly effective devices. They did not require any form of wireless internet connection to function. They did not transmit a continuous video signal to a remote cloud server. They simply recorded high-definition video and audio directly onto internal removable physical memory cards. They were entirely invisible to Victor's sophisticated network scanners. I walked directly up to the main cashier, an older silent man who did not ask probing questions, and paid for the discreet purchase using crisp $100 bills I had recently withdrawn from my wallet. There was absolutely no digital paper trail. There was no instant bank notification. There was nothing connecting Richard Callahan to this transaction. I drove back to the sprawling estate with a newfound exhilarating sense of cold, calculated purpose. The cheap burner phone and the hidden analog cameras were tucked safely inside the deep inner lining of my heavy leather jacket. When I finally walked back through the grand front doors, the house was perfectly quiet. Emily was out running afternoon errands with the baby, and Victor was once again securely locked inside his converted guest wing office, blindly trusting his digital fortress. I casually walked down the main central corridor, pausing for just a fleeting moment to internally acknowledge the subtle whir of Victor's overhead dome camera as it smoothly tracked my physical movement. I offered the dark lens a polite, dismissive nod and stepped calmly inside my private study, closing the solid mahogany door firmly behind me. I knew that I had to move with extreme practiced caution. I knew Victor had one high-definition camera pointed directly at my desk and another focused entirely on the antique maritime painting, intentionally hiding my wall safe. But I also knew exactly where those invasive cameras simply could not see. I pulled the tiny battery-powered analog pinhole cameras from my jacket pocket. I moved swiftly toward the massive floor-to-ceiling oak bookshelves lining the far eastern wall of the study. This specific area was situated squarely in the absolute dark zone of Victor's overlapping surveillance grid. I carefully wedged the first analog camera tightly between a stack of heavy leather-bound encyclopedias, angling the tiny black lens perfectly to capture a wide view of the entire room. It would clearly record anyone entering the study and physically approaching the desk. I quickly took the second camera and moved silently toward an ornate, towering antique grandfather clock standing in the dark corner. I secured the tiny device just behind the carved wooden finial, pointing it directly at the open space in front of the maritime painting. This specific camera would perfectly capture the exact hand movements of anyone standing directly in front of my hidden safe. I manually activated the internal lithium batteries, taking extra time to ensure the tiny red recording lights were securely covered and blackened out with electrical tape. The analog counter-surveillance trap was now fully operational, humming silently and invisibly in the deep shadows of my study. These tiny devices would record continuously and flawlessly for 72 straight hours on a single battery charge, storing every passing second of high-definition footage securely onto their physical memory cards. Because they were completely disconnected from the main house network, they were rendered utterly and permanently invisible to Victor's massive server rack down the hall. He could monitor my daily network traffic all he wanted. He could watch me sit quietly at my desk and sort through mundane shipping paperwork. But the exact moment he stepped into this private room to execute his illegal transfers, my hidden analog lenses would capture his every move. I finished adjusting the angle of the final hidden camera, took a long, steadying breath, and walked calmly back to my desk. I sat down heavily in my comfortable leather armchair, opened a thick manila folder, and began to review a standard logistics report. I slowly looked up at the vaulted ceiling, staring directly into the dark, unblinking lens of the security camera Victor had installed to monitor me. I offered it a very small, incredibly knowing smile. The helpless prey had officially become the apex predator. I was no longer a clueless victim trapped blindly inside a digital cage. I had successfully drawn the new battle lines using the absolute oldest reliable physical tactics in the book. All I had to do now was patiently wait for the inevitable darkness to fall, wait for the large house to go completely silent, and wait for my arrogant son-in-law to walk directly into the inescapable snare I had built for him. The house settled into a deep, heavy slumber shortly after midnight. I remained fully clothed, sitting completely still in the dark corner of my master bedroom, listening to the rhythmic breathing of the central air conditioning system. I waited patiently until the digital clock on my nightstand shifted to exactly 2 in the morning. This was the hour of absolute vulnerability. I knew Victor had established a rigid schedule for his illicit digital operations, often leaving his workstation briefly to monitor the automated overseas transfers from a secondary tablet in his private bathroom. I stood up, my joints aching slightly in the cool night air, and walked silently out of my bedroom. I moved down the long carpeted corridor with the practiced stealth of a man who had spent a lifetime inspecting quiet shipping warehouses in the dead of night. I bypassed the main hallway, taking a narrow secondary passage that led directly to the guest wing. I knew exactly where Victor had positioned his internal motion sensors. I simply hugged the far wall, sliding beneath the wide, sweeping angle of the primary dome camera, moving entirely within the calculated blind spots I had mapped out earlier that week. I reached the heavy oak door of Victor's converted home office. The biometric lock glowed with a faint, pulsing blue light. But Victor had made a fatal, arrogant mistake. He was so incredibly confident in his impenetrable digital firewall that he had neglected basic physical security protocols while working inside his own sanctuary. The heavy door was pushed slightly ajar, left open just a fraction of an inch, to allow the cool air from the hallway to circulate around the massive, overheating server racks. I pushed the door open with a slow, agonizingly careful push, slipping into the dark room. The heat inside the office was immediately oppressive, thick with the dry, metallic scent of hot circuit boards and running machinery. The towering black server cabinet hummed loudly in the corner, its blinking green and blue diagnostic lights casting strange, shifting shadows across the walls. I moved deliberately toward Victor's massive desk, keeping my breathing shallow and completely silent. Victor's primary workstation was a sprawling arrangement of 3 massive curved monitors. The screens were dark-locked securely behind complex encrypted password walls. But I was not there to hack into a live military-grade operating system. I was looking for the weak link in the physical chain. I knelt quietly behind the heavy desk and ran my hands along the thick bundles of black cables snaking down from the monitors. My fingers brushed against a small, cold rectangular object tucked discreetly behind the primary processing unit. It was a high-capacity, solid-state physical backup drive. Victor, like many modern tech executives, trusted the cloud for his active operations, but he maintained a localized physical mirror drive for his absolute most critical encrypted structural code. He had left it physically plugged into the auxiliary port, likely assuming that no one in this house possessed the technical literacy to even recognize what it was. I carefully disconnected the small drive, slipping it into my pocket, and replaced it with an identical blank drive I had purchased at the rural electronics store earlier that afternoon. I did not attempt to read the drive inside his office. That would be incredibly foolish. I silently retreated from the guest wing, retracing my steps through the blind spots, and returned to the absolute safety of my own locked study. I pulled down the heavy window shades, ensuring the room was pitch black. I powered on a completely clean offline laptop I had hidden inside a hollowed-out encyclopedia volume on my bottom bookshelf. This machine had never been connected to Victor's compromised internet router. It was a digital ghost. I took a deep breath, plugged Victor's stolen backup drive into the side port, and waited for the screen to illuminate. Victor had protected the drive with a localized password, but without his main server firewall to block brute force attempts. It was a surprisingly fragile lock. I used a simple aggressive decryption software program I had acquired years ago for corporate auditing purposes. Within 10 short minutes, the protective barrier collapsed, and the raw contents of Victor's secret digital life spilled completely open across my glowing screen. The sheer volume of data was absolutely staggering, but I knew exactly what to look for. I bypassed the dense folders of proprietary coding and navigated directly into a hidden directory simply labeled with a string of seemingly random numbers. I opened the first file, and the blood instantly drained from my face. Staring back at me was a flawlessly forged, high-resolution copy of my own personal signature. It was attached to a complex international wire transfer authorization form. I opened the next file, and then the next. There were hundreds of them. Dozens of legal corporate documents, massive banking authorization forms, and binding international trade agreements. Every single one of them bore the official registered seal of Callahan Logistics, and every single one of them was digitally signed by Richard Callahan. My stomach twisted into a violent knot as I scrolled through the endless pages of fabricated evidence. Victor had not simply stolen my identity. He had completely hijacked the entire legal structure of my life's work. I opened the master financial ledger, and the horrifying truth of his operation finally unfolded in stark, terrifying detail. Victor was actively running a massive high-speed money laundering node for a deeply entrenched South American cartel. He was receiving incredibly large deposits of dirty illicit cash from a vast network of anonymous shell companies intentionally registered in Panama and the Cayman Islands. These funds were being disguised as legitimate shipping payments for international freight routes that simply did not exist. The dirty money flowed directly into the secondary holding accounts of Callahan Logistics, instantly gaining the pristine, highly respected shine of my legitimate corporate enterprise. Once the money was officially washed clean by my company name, Victor used an automated script to immediately bounce the funds out of the country, dumping the clean cash directly into completely untraceable offshore cryptocurrency exchanges. He was moving tens of millions of dollars every single month. I stared at the final column on the glowing spreadsheet, my eyes locking onto the total cumulative volume of laundered cash. It was a staggering $50 million. The absolute brilliance and utter depravity of Victor's criminal design left me completely breathless. He had built a flawless financial engine that generated massive wealth for ruthless criminals, taking a heavy percentage for himself as a transaction fee. But the most terrifying aspect of the entire operation was the meticulous legal trap he had deliberately laid out for me. Victor had entirely insulated himself from the crimes. His name did not appear on a single banking document. The startup company he supposedly managed was merely an empty corporate shell. Every illicit transaction was tied directly back to Richard Callahan. If the federal authorities eventually raided the operation, I would absolutely go to federal prison for the rest of my natural life, and Victor would simply walk away completely clean. I sat quietly in the darkness of my study, staring at the glowing screen of my solid offline laptop. The sheer crushing weight of Victor's betrayal threatened to suffocate me in that room. But as a man who had spent 4 decades navigating the ruthless, unforgiving world of global shipping logistics, I did not have the luxury of despair. I had to act, and I had to act with absolute surgical precision. I safely ejected the physical backup drive from the side port and carefully tucked it deep into my shirt pocket. I reached into my desk drawer and retrieved the prepaid burner phone I had purchased with cash earlier that day at the rural truck stop. I powered the device on, waiting patiently for the generic digital chime to signal a secure cellular connection. I did not dial the local police department. I did not dial my corporate attorneys. A local precinct would be completely out of their depth dealing with an international cybercrime ring, and my corporate lawyers would simply panic instantly, freezing the accounts and alerting Victor before we could trap him. I needed federal firepower, and fortunately I had raised a son who possessed exactly that. My eldest child, David, is a senior field agent for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specializing exclusively in organized crime and international financial syndicates. David and I had maintained a somewhat distant relationship over the past few years, mostly due to the demanding, secretive nature of his career. But blood and loyalty run incredibly deep in our family. I dialed his direct, unlisted field number from memory, listening to the hollow ring. The line connected after 3 tense rings before his sharp, professional voice answered the call. I did not bother with pleasantries or formal greetings. I told him it was his father, that I was using an untraceable burner phone to bypass a compromised network, and that I was currently staring at absolute proof of a $50 million cartel money laundering operation actively running from inside my own house. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When David finally spoke, his tone had shifted from a tired federal agent to a highly alert tactical operator. He did not question my sanity. He asked me for names, routing numbers, and corporate holding accounts. I read him the data directly from the files I had extracted from Victor's stolen backup drive. I gave him the IP addresses Victor was utilizing to mask his location, the names of the Panamanian shell companies, and the offshore cryptocurrency exchanges receiving the washed funds. I could hear David typing furiously on a terminal in the background, the clicking of his keyboard cutting through the static of the cellular connection. After 10 minutes of waiting in the dark, David let out a low, tense breath. He told me, his voice tight with controlled adrenaline, that the shell companies I had just named matched a cartel investigation the Bureau had been tracking for nearly 2 years. They knew the cartel was using a sophisticated domestic ghost node to wash their illicit cash, but they had never been able to locate the exact source because it was brilliantly hidden behind the legitimate corporate shield of Callahan Logistics. David's voice grew incredibly urgent. He told me that by extracting this specific data from the physical drive I had just handed him, the absolute holy grail of the entire federal investigation. But then, as he dug deeper into the active routing tables, he noticed something absolutely terrifying. As he monitored the live network traffic routing through the identified IP addresses, he saw a massive automated queue forming within the banking portal. Victor was not planning to slowly wash the remaining funds over the next few months to avoid detection. A monumental final transfer of the entire $50 million sum was fully scheduled to execute and clear automatically at exactly 4 in the morning. Victor was preparing to drain the holding accounts, finalize his commission, and permanently burn the digital bridge, leaving me holding the entire blazing inferno. If that transfer cleared into the decentralized crypto exchanges, the money would vanish forever into the dark web, and I would instantly become the prime suspect in a massive federal indictment. I asked David what our immediate tactical play was. I told him I could walk down the hallway, kick down the guest office door, and physically smash the towering server rack to pieces with a heavy wrench. David immediately and forcefully ordered me to stand down. He explained that if the transfer failed due to an unexpected hardware malfunction, Victor would simply reboot the system and manually try again. Or worse, he would instantly alert his ruthless cartel handlers that the node was compromised, putting my life, Emily's life, and the baby's life in immediate lethal danger. We needed to be infinitely smarter than a simple physical confrontation. We needed to let Victor believe the automated transfer was proceeding exactly as planned. We needed to catch him absolutely red-handed, with his fingers actively dancing across the keyboard, while simultaneously securing the illicit funds. David quickly outlined a brilliant, highly dangerous masterstroke. He gave me a highly classified federal fraud override code. It was a specific, complex digital alphanumeric sequence used exclusively by the highest levels of the federal treasury to instantly freeze and divert illicit international funds without triggering automated alarms on the user end. He told me that I needed to log into my primary corporate banking portal using my executive credentials. I had to locate the massive pending $50 million wire transfer waiting in the queue and silently inject this federal code directly into the routing metadata. If I executed the code correctly, the bank's automated systems would visibly display the transfer as perfectly successful on Victor's end. His monitors would show the money cleanly leaving the accounts. He would believe he had won his dangerous game. But in reality, the digital override would instantly hijack the outgoing funds, bypassing the anonymous offshore cryptocurrency exchanges. The $50 million would be silently and forcefully redirected into a frozen federal trap account fully controlled by the FBI. I memorized the complex sequence of numbers and letters, repeating them back to David twice to ensure absolute perfection. He told me that his federal tactical team was already mobilizing. They were quietly establishing a secure perimeter around my estate, waiting in the dark shadows of the old oak trees. He told me to execute the override stay completely out of sight and wait for his signal. I ended the call and powered off the burner phone. I opened the encrypted banking portal on my offline laptop, using my physical security token to bypass the standard authentication protocols. I found the massive pending transfer exactly where David said it would be, silently ticking down toward the 4 o'clock execution window. I carefully typed the federal override sequence into the routing metadata, verifying every single character. I pressed the execution key. The screen pulsed green, quietly confirming the brutal trap was set. Victor's digital guillotine had been successfully dismantled and replaced with a federal snare. I closed my laptop and sat in the profound silence of my study. The digital trap was securely set, but the physical reality of the storm was about to crash into my home. I stood up and walked over to the antique maritime painting. I bypassed the wall safe, pressing my hand against a concealed wooden panel. A narrow section of the oak bookshelf swung silently inward, revealing a descending staircase. I stepped inside and pulled the hidden door shut behind me. I walked down the concrete steps into the reinforced basement, a space Victor knew absolutely nothing about. It was an old storm shelter I had retrofitted years ago. Now it was my command center. I sat at a small metal table and pulled heavy black headphones over my ears. Earlier that afternoon, I had discreetly planted a directional microphone underneath the large leather sofa in the main living room. I flipped the switch on my audio receiver. A soft hiss of static filled my ears, instantly followed by the crystal-clear sound of my living room directly above my head. I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. I could hear Victor pacing back and forth across the hardwood floor, his leather shoes clicking with an agitated energy. Emily and the baby were fast asleep in the main master suite, completely removed from the blast radius of what was about to happen. I checked my wristwatch. It was exactly 4:15 in the morning. The transfer had initiated 15 minutes ago. The money was locked in the FBI trap account. Victor's cartel handlers were expecting their cash to arrive in their offshore wallets at any second. I sat in the cold basement listening to the ceiling, waiting for the knock. The wait was agonizingly short. At 4:22, the silence was shattered by a low rumbling sound coming from the front driveway. It was the distinct growl of multiple heavy engines idling just outside the main portico. I leaned closer to the audio receiver, pressing the headphones tightly. Victor suddenly stopped pacing. I heard his sharp intake of breath as he moved toward the front of the house. There was no forceful knocking or ringing of the doorbell. Victor had unlocked the front doors himself, anticipating their arrival to celebrate the completion of the massive financial wash. I heard the heavy door swing open instantly, followed by the synchronized footsteps of at least 4 large men entering my grand foyer. They did not speak a single word of greeting. The men walked directly into the living room, their boots thudding against the Persian rug. Victor's voice came through the microphone, sounding forced and desperately eager to please. He welcomed them to the house, his tone pitching high with false confidence. He told them the final node sequence had executed flawlessly just 20 minutes ago, and that the $50 million was safely resting in their designated crypto wallets. He invited them to sit down, offering a drink to celebrate their success. A long, suffocating silence followed his nervous babbling. It was the kind of dangerous silence that sucks all the oxygen out of a room. Then a new voice spoke. It was deep, coarse, and dripping with a cold, terrifying menace. The cartel boss did not raise his voice. He spoke with the quiet, deadly calm of a man who held absolute power. He addressed Victor directly, mispronouncing his name slightly, turning the greeting into an insult. He stated very plainly that he had not come to celebrate. He said he had just received a message from his offshore financial brokers. The designated wallets were completely empty. Not a single dollar of the $50 million had arrived. The boss took a slow, deliberate step closer to Victor. The sound of his heavy boots filled my headphones. He asked Victor in a tone that sent a shiver down my spine where exactly his money had gone. Victor immediately began to stammer, his false confidence completely evaporating. He frantically denied any failure, insisting the transfer had been a total success. I could hear the desperate shuffling of his laptop being dragged across the glass coffee table. Victor began typing furiously, his breath hitching in a blind panic. He begged the boss to look at the screen. He pointed out the routing metadata, desperately explaining that the banknode showed a completed outward wire. He swore on his life that the money had cleared the domestic firewall and was currently floating in the digital ether, simply delayed by heavy network traffic. He pleaded for just a few more hours, promising that the funds would materialize by sunrise. The cartel boss let out a dry, humorless chuckle. It was a sound completely devoid of any human empathy. He told Victor he did not care about network traffic or digital delays. He only cared about results, and the result was that $50 million had simply vanished into thin air under Victor's direct supervision. The boss took another slow, heavy step forward. I heard a distinct, terrifying sound ring out through the directional microphone. It was the sharp click of a heavy handgun being cocked and readied to fire. The sound cut through the tense air of the living room like a physical blade. Victor let out a pathetic whimper, the sound of a man who realizes his own cleverness cannot save him from raw violence. The boss spoke again, his voice dropping to a harsh, guttural whisper. He told Victor he was going to press the cold steel barrel of his weapon directly against his forehead. I clearly heard the dull thud of the metal connecting with bone, followed instantly by Victor's frantic, hyperventilating sobs. He was openly begging for his life, pleading for a chance to run a diagnostic trace on the server rack in the guest wing. The cartel boss ignored his desperate crying. He delivered his absolute final ultimatum. He told Victor that he had exactly 60 seconds to make the $50 million appear in the designated offshore accounts. If the money did not miraculously materialize before that minute expired, he was going to pull the trigger, painting my expensive living room walls with Victor's brains. He then promised to walk down the hallway and visit Emily and the baby to collect the remaining balance in blood. Sitting in the dark basement, listening to the absolute terror unfolding directly above me, I felt a strange, cold satisfaction wash over my mind. Victor had arrogantly built a criminal empire inside my home, believing he was untouchable. Now he was quite literally staring down the barrel of his own destruction, completely trapped by the very monsters he thought he could control. He was begging for a digital miracle that I had personally ensured would never arrive. I kept the headphones pressed tightly against my ears, listening to the final agonizing seconds tick away, waiting for the heavy wooden door upstairs to burst completely open, knowing that my son David and his federal tactical team were already moving silently across the front lawn, preparing to bring the full devastating weight of the law crashing down upon them all. The agonizing seconds slowly stretched into what felt like an absolute eternity. I sat completely frozen in the cold, damp air of my hidden basement, gripping the edge of the metal table. Through the high-fidelity directional microphone, every single sound occurring in my living room directly above me was amplified with terrifying clarity. I could hear the heavy, ragged breathing of my son-in-law as he choked on his own rising panic. I could hear the subtle, metallic scrape of the cartel boss, adjusting his grip on the heavy handgun, pressed firmly against Victor's temple. The silence was heavy, oppressive, and utterly devoid of any mercy. The boss simply waited a predator, allowing his trapped prey to completely exhaust itself in a pathetic display of fear. Victor broke. He did not break with dignity or defiance. He broke with a sickening, high-pitched wail of absolute cowardice. When faced with the immediate, undeniable reality of his own violent death, the polished, confident executive persona completely dissolved, leaving behind a frantic, sniveling rat, desperate to chew through anyone and anything to save his own skin. He began speaking so rapidly that his words violently collided into one another, his voice vibrating with a raw, unfiltered terror. He begged the man not to pull the trigger. He swore on his life, on his soul, that he had not stolen the $50 million. But then Victor's desperate mind found the only remaining exit strategy. He found his ultimate scapegoat. I listened, my blood turning to absolute ice as Victor threw me entirely under the speeding bus. He screamed that it was the old man. He yelled my name, Richard Callahan, echoing through the room. Victor frantically explained to the cartel boss that I was not the clueless, retired logistics manager I pretended to be. He fabricated a brilliant, instantaneous lie, claiming that I had somehow discovered the secret money laundering node operating within my guest wing. Victor shouted that I still retained the highest-level executive clearance codes for Callahan Logistics. He told the armed criminals that I must have secretly accessed the primary corporate banking portal while he was not looking, and deliberately flagged the massive outward transfer. He painted me as a greedy, calculating mastermind who had deliberately hijacked their cartel funds at the very last possible second. The sheer audacity of his lie was staggering, but he did not stop there. Victor needed to make himself valuable to the cartel again. He needed to prove that he was still on their side. Through the heavy headphones, I heard Victor outline a plan so deeply malicious, so fundamentally evil, that it momentarily stopped my heart. Victor told the boss that the frozen $50 million was not lost forever. He explained that because I was the one who initiated the security freeze, I was the only person who possessed the biometric credentials and the master override passwords required to release the money from the frozen holding accounts. He told the armed, dangerous men exactly where to find me. He instructed them to quietly walk up the grand sweeping staircase and enter the main corridor. He told them my exact bedroom layout, detailing the precise location of my door. Then Victor delivered his monstrous directive. He told the cartel boss to take his men upstairs, drag me out of my bed, and tie me to a chair. He urged them to torture me. He explicitly told them to break my fingers to inflict as much pain as physically possible until I surrendered the secondary release codes. His voice held absolutely no hesitation, no remorse, and no familial loyalty. He was actively and enthusiastically directing a violent cartel hit squad to brutally torture his father-in-law in the middle of the night just to save his own pathetic life. The cartel boss remained completely silent, letting Victor dig his grave deeper. Encouraged by the lack of an immediate bullet to the head, Victor continued to pitch his gruesome survival strategy. He promised the boss that once they extracted the override codes from me and secured their $50 million, they should just put a bullet directly into my brain. He told them to kill me and make it look like a tragic, violent home invasion. The justification he provided next made me physically nauseous. Victor calmly stated that if I was dead, my daughter Emily would immediately inherit the entire Callahan Logistics corporate empire, the massive estate, and all of the associated financial networks. He bragged that he controlled his wife completely, and with me permanently removed from the equation, he would have absolute, unrestricted access to wash hundreds of millions of dollars for the cartel, without ever having to hide his operations again. He was offering my murder as a strategic business expansion. I sat in the dark, my hands trembling with a rage so profound it felt like burning acid in my veins. But the absolute worst revelation was yet to come. The cartel boss finally spoke, his deep voice cutting through Victor's frantic rambling. He asked Victor why they should trust a man who could not even control his own household, a man who had to hide his operations in his father-in-law's guest room. Victor's response was the final, devastating piece of a puzzle I had not even realized I was trying to solve. Victor let out a desperate, breathless laugh, trying to prove his ruthless dedication to their criminal enterprise. He confessed everything. He told the boss that he had always planned to hijack Callahan Logistics. He admitted that the devastating electrical fire that had destroyed his and Emily's previous home 6 months ago was not a tragic accident. Victor proudly confessed that he had intentionally poured highly flammable accelerant into the walls of his own house and deliberately burned it to the ground. He had purposefully destroyed his own home, traumatized his innocent wife, and risked the life of his infant son purely to manufacture a crisis. He needed a plausible, sympathetic excuse to force his way into my secure estate. He burned his house down simply to infiltrate mine. He manipulated my deep paternal love and my protective instincts, knowing I would instantly open my doors to shelter my displaced family. He had orchestrated the entire tragedy just to gain physical access to the corporate network hubs located inside my guest wing. Hearing those words aloud broke something fundamental inside my soul. The betrayal was absolute, transcending mere anger. This man was a parasite. He looked at my weeping daughter as she watched her belongings turn to ash, knowing he had struck the match. He accepted my charity, eaten my food, and slept under my roof, all while engineering my destruction. I slowly removed the headphones, placing them onto the metal table. I did not need to listen anymore. The horrific truth had been laid bare. Victor had transitioned from an arrogant fraudster into a willing murderer. He handed my life over to an execution squad without hesitation. But as I sat in the silent safety of my hidden bunker, I knew his grand design had ultimately failed completely here tonight. Through the headphones, the sickening reality of the moment crystallized into sharp focus. The cartel boss did not offer Victor any words of comfort for his horrific confession. He simply issued a series of cold, guttural commands. The metallic clatter of automatic weapons being simultaneously racked and loaded echoed through the directional microphone with terrifying clarity. It was the distinct sound of men preparing to commit extreme violence within the quiet walls of my home. I heard the heavy boots of the hitmen pivot away from Victor. They began moving with tactical precision across the Persian rug, heading directly toward the grand staircase. I sat in the cold, dimly lit basement, my hands resting completely still upon the smooth metal table. Every muscle in my body was coiled tightly, vibrating with the massive surge of adrenaline coursing through my veins. The microphone captured the subtle creak of the wooden floorboards directly above my head as the cartel enforcers began their steady, methodical ascent. They were moving upstairs to drag me out of bed, to break my bones, and to execute me in cold blood. And Victor, the polished corporate executive who had married my daughter, was simply letting it happen. He was actively celebrating his perceived salvation. Through the audio feed, I listened to Victor let out a long, shuddering breath of profound relief. The immediate threat to his life had walked out of the living room and was climbing the stairs to end mine. I heard the delicate clinking of crystal glass coming from my private liquor cabinet. Victor was actually pouring himself a drink. He reached for my finest bottle of aged scotch, saved for my grandson's birth. I pictured his smug, arrogant face perfectly in my mind's eye. He was standing in my living room, swirling the amber liquid in a heavy tumbler, taking a slow sip while waiting patiently for the muffled sounds of my torture to filter down from the second floor. He genuinely believed he had won. He believed his masterstroke of betrayal had successfully shifted the cartel's lethal focus, leaving him completely free to inherit my logistics empire and continue washing their dirty money. The heavy footfalls of the cartel hitmen echoed loudly through the ceiling, moving methodically down the main upstairs corridor. They bypassed Emily's room entirely, following Victor's precise directions straight toward the master suite. My breathing slowed to a deliberate rhythmic pace. I visualized the hallway above me. I knew exactly where they were standing. I could practically see the dark, tactical fabric of their clothing and the cold steel of their weapons glinting in the faint moonlight filtering through the corridor windows. They stopped moving. A suffocating silence fell over the upper floor. They were stacking up outside my bedroom door, preparing to breach the room with overwhelming lethal force. Down in the basement, I gently slid the heavy headphones down around my neck. I did not need the directional microphone to hear what was about to happen next. The sound would be loud enough to penetrate the reinforced concrete ceiling. I waited in the absolute darkness of my hidden bunker, my eyes fixed securely on the small electronic device resting on the table in front of me. It was a customized, heavily encrypted federal panic button David had given me during our incredibly tense phone call earlier that night. It was a direct, instantaneous link to the Tactical Command Center currently coordinating the massive federal strike force hidden in the thick woods surrounding my property. Suddenly, a massive, violent crash shook the very foundation of the estate. The cartel hitmen had kicked my solid oak bedroom door completely off its brass hinges. The explosive sound of splintering wood and shattering door frames echoed terribly through the quiet night air. I knew exactly what they were doing in that precise moment. They were rushing aggressively into the large master suite, their automatic weapons raised, and ready to fire their flashlights piercing the darkness, sweeping violently across the room to locate their designated target. They expected to find a terrified, confused old man waking up from a deep sleep, completely unprepared for the brutal violence they were about to inflict. Instead, they found nothing. The custom-made mattress was perfectly made, the expensive linen sheets completely undisturbed. The attached master bathroom was dark and entirely empty. The expansive walk-in closets held nothing but hanging clothes and rows of polished shoes. The hitmen tore through the suite with an escalating sense of frantic urgency, flipping the heavy mattress, kicking open the bathroom doors, and sweeping their flashlights under the heavy furniture. But Richard Callahan was not there. The sacrificial lamb Victor had so eagerly offered up to slaughter was nowhere to be found. The room was a complete and utter void. Through the ambient silence of the house, I could hear the muffled, angry shouts of the cartel enforcers filtering down through the floorboards. Their initial tactical discipline, was rapidly disintegrating into raw, unfiltered panic. They were highly trained killers, but they were now trapped inside a massive, unfamiliar house, and their primary target had inexplicably vanished into thin air. The realization that they had walked directly into a blind, empty room sent a shockwave of profound confusion rippling through their ranks. I knew they were currently radioing down to their boss in the living room, screaming that the bedroom was completely empty, that the old man was missing, and that Victor had lied to them again. I pictured Victor standing frozen in the living room, the crystal glass of expensive scotch, suddenly feeling incredibly heavy in his trembling hand. The smug, arrogant smile would be melting rapidly from his face, replaced instantly by the cold, terrifying realization that he had lost total control of the situation. His perfect scapegoat had disappeared. The $50 million was still permanently locked in a frozen account, and he was completely alone in a room with a ruthless cartel boss who had just run out of patience. I reached out my hand and rested my fingers very lightly against the smooth red surface of the federal panic button. The cold metal table beneath my arms grounded me in the intense reality of the moment. I had spent my entire life building this estate, building my company, and protecting my family from the harsh realities of the world. Victor had brought the absolute worst kind of evil directly across my threshold. He had weaponized my home and threatened the lives of my daughter and my innocent grandson. He had forced me to play a dangerous, lethal game on a digital battlefield he thought he controlled. But Victor had forgotten one crucial rule. You never surrender the home field advantage. I had meticulously prepared the battleground. I had intercepted the stolen money. I completely neutralized his desperate play for survival. He was trapped, isolated, and entirely out of options. The analog snare I had constructed was now pulling tight around his neck. I pressed the small red button down until it locked into place with a satisfying, decisive click. A bright green indicator light instantly illuminated, confirming the encrypted digital signal was successfully transmitted directly to David. It was the absolute green light for the Federal Bureau of Investigation to aggressively breach the perimeter, storm the entire estate, and bring the full, devastating power of the United States government crashing down upon Victor and the cartel monsters currently occupying my living room. I sat back in my comfortable metal chair, folding my tired hands together in the absolute dark. My breathing remained perfectly calm and remarkably steady. The invisible trap I had spent the entire night meticulously building was finally sprung. Now I just patiently waited for the heavy front wooden doors above me to violently explode. The absolute silence following their discovery of the empty bedroom was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. Through the directional microphone, the frantic breathing of the hitmen upstairs echoed loudly in my ears. They had aggressively kicked down a solid oak door, expecting to find a sleeping victim, only to find a perfectly made vacant bed. I could hear their heavy boots shuffling in a disorganized panic. One of them keyed a two-way radio, his voice cracking with sudden dread as he prepared to deliver the inexplicably bad news to his violent boss waiting in the living room below. He inhaled sharply, his finger pressing the transmission button, but the words never left his throat. Before the cartel enforcer could utter a single syllable, the sequence was initiated with a concussive roar that literally shook the concrete foundations of my estate. The sheer kinetic force of the blast traveled down through the floor joists, sending a fine cloud of gray dust raining down upon my shoulders in the hidden basement. My directional microphone peaked and squealed, forcing me to quickly lower the volume dial, but I could still hear the symphony of absolute tactical destruction unfolding completely directly above me. The massive floor-to-ceiling bay windows of the living room violently shattered inward. The sound was a deafening crystalline explosion, immediately followed by the blinding, white-hot detonation of multiple flashbang grenades. A fraction of a second later, the custom steel-reinforced front doors were completely blown off their heavy hinges. I heard the massive slabs of wood and metal crash violently onto the imported marble tiles of the grand foyer. The secure, insulated world Victor thought he commanded was instantly torn apart by overwhelming synchronized federal force. Over the chaotic ringing of the stun blast, I heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of dozens of armored boots flooding into the mansion. It was not a chaotic scramble. It was a fluid, highly orchestrated wave of tactical supremacy. Sharp, commanding voices cut through the thick smoke and confusion. I immediately recognized the authoritative booming voice of my son David. He was barking precise directives, orchestrating the rapid subjugation of the cartel threat. He commanded the hitmen on the second floor to drop their weapons and interlock their fingers behind their heads. The cartel enforcers' men who had just casually planned my execution were completely and utterly neutralized in a matter of seconds. The element of total surprise combined with overwhelming federal firepower rendered their weapons utterly useless. Through the audio feed, I heard the heavy clatter of their automatic rifles hitting the hardwood floors, followed by the dull, heavy thuds of large men being forcefully pinned to the ground. Zip ties zipped tightly around their wrists. The immediate threat of physical violence was entirely eradicated before they even comprehended what had hit them. Downstairs in the living room, the situation was equally swift and decisive. The cartel boss, who had just pressed a loaded and lethal handgun against Victor's forehead, was tackled hard against the mahogany coffee table. I heard the heavy glass shatter under his weight as federal agents swarmed his position, stripping him of his weapons and his perceived authority. And Victor, my cowardly, calculating son-in-law, I could perfectly picture his pathetic reaction. The microphone captured the sharp, fragile sound of crystal shattering against the floor. Victor had dropped his glass of my finest scotch. The amber liquid he had poured to celebrate my impending murder was now seeping into the expensive rugs. He did not scream. He did not even try to run. He was completely and utterly paralyzed by a profound, suffocating shock. The sudden, violent reality of a heavily armed FBI SWAT team materializing inside his secure sanctuary shattered his entire psychological framework. He was a man who lived exclusively in digital algorithms and encrypted networks. Faced with the raw physical manifestation of federal law enforcement, his mind simply shut down. I remained seated in the basement for 3 additional minutes, allowing the chaotic noise upstairs to settle into a controlled, orderly hum. I listened as David confirmed the primary perimeter was completely secure over his own personal tactical radio. The house was locked down. The hostile targets were fully restrained and effectively neutralized. I slowly stood up, pushing the metal chair back from the table. I smoothed the wrinkles from my shirt, took a deep, steadying breath, and turned toward the hidden staircase. I pressed the concealed release mechanism, swinging the heavy bookshelf door open. I stepped out of the dark, narrow passage and back into the familiar surroundings of my private study. I opened the study door and walked calmly into the main central corridor. The air was thick with the acrid chemical smell of explosive residue and deployed stun grenades. A light haze of white smoke drifted lazily through the hallway, illuminated by the harsh, sweeping beams of tactical flashlights. Heavily armed agents in dark tactical gear were methodically clearing the remaining rooms, their weapons lowered but ready. I walked past them with measured, deliberate steps. They did not stop me. David had already briefed his commanding officers on my exact physical description and my crucial role in dismantling the cartel node. I turned the corner and stepped into the sprawling, devastated living room. The scene was a chaotic masterpiece of poetic justice. The incredibly large and heavy bay windows were entirely gone, replaced by a jagged perimeter of broken glass and the flashing red and blue lights of federal vehicles parked across my pristine front lawn. The cartel boss was lying face down on the ruined carpet, his arms bound tightly behind his back, a heavily armored federal agent kneeling firmly between his shoulder blades. The other enforcers were lined up against the far wall, stripped of their power and reduced to common criminals awaiting transport. And then my eyes locked onto Victor. He was kneeling on the floor near the shattered remains of the ruined coffee table. His expensive tailored suit was covered in dust and spilled scotch. His hands were securely zip-tied in front of him. He was staring blankly at the floor, his chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. The arrogant, untouchable mastermind who had burned his own home to ashes just to infiltrate mine was completely shattered. He looked small, pathetic, and entirely defeated. He had gambled everything on a flawless digital lie, entirely underestimating the relentless, unforgiving power of truth. David emerged from the guest wing corridor, his tactical vest heavy with equipment, his radio buzzing with constant rapid updates. He spotted me standing in the archway and offered a sharp, professional nod. The proud, stoic expression on his face communicated everything I needed to know. We had won. The $50 million was securely locked inside a federal vault. The dangerous cartel node was permanently dismantled. The men who came to kill me were bound in chains. I walked slowly across the ruined room, my shoes crunching loudly over the broken glass. I stopped directly in front of Victor. He flinched at the sound of my approach, his head snapping up to look at me. He wept completely. His broad shoulders shook with violent, uncontrollable tremors as the harsh reality of his situation finally settled into his calculating mind. The heavy tactical boots of the federal agents surrounded him, creating an impenetrable wall of dark uniforms and drawn weapons. I stood in the ruined archway for a long moment, simply observing the pathetic destruction of the man who had tried to systematically dismantle my entire life. The acrid smoke from the stun grenades continued to drift lazily toward the high vaulted ceilings, stinging my eyes, but I refused to blink. I stepped fully into the main living room, the thick rubber soles of my shoes grinding against the shattered glass of the ruined bay windows. My right hand rested firmly by my side, gripping the heavy steel frame of my antique revolver, while my left hand tightly clutched the small, black USB drive containing the undeniable analog video evidence of his meticulous forgery. The agents parted seamlessly, recognizing my authority, allowing me to approach the center of the chaos. David stood tall over his captive, his federal badge gleaming in the harsh tactical lights. He nodded at me, a silent acknowledgement of the trap we had successfully executed. Two heavily armored officers grabbed Victor by his expensive suit jacket, hoisting him roughly from his knees and slamming his chest hard against the polished hardwood floor. The heavy metallic click of steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists echoed sharply through the devastated room. He was pinned helpless, completely stripped of his power. Victor twisted his head to look up at me, his face bruised and smeared with dust from the explosive breach. His eyes, usually so cold and calculating, were blown wide with an animalistic terror. He saw the revolver in my hand. He saw the flash drive. And in that singular moment, he finally understood the profound depth of his own failure. He realized that the quiet, retired logistics manager he had dismissed as a clueless old man had entirely orchestrated his total annihilation. He had walked willingly into an analog snare that his digital algorithms could never predict. Victor began to thrash against the unyielding grip of the federal agents, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, desperate whine. He ignored the federal officers, focusing his terrified gaze entirely on me. He desperately tried to play his absolute last pathetic card. "Richard, please," he sobbed, the spit flying from his lips as he struggled against the cold floor. "You have to listen to me. They made me do it. I was trapped. Think of Emily. Think of your grandson. I am family. We are family. You cannot let them do this to me." I stood directly over him, casting a long, dark shadow across his trembling, pathetic body. I did not feel a single fleeting ounce of pity for his tears. I absolutely did not feel the familiar, gentle warmth of paternal forgiveness. I looked down at his ruined face with the cold, unforgiving eyes of a 70-year-old wolf who had stubbornly survived the most ruthless, violent depths of the global corporate jungle. I had spent decades building an empire, crushing competitors, and protecting my own. I knew exactly what a predator looked like, and Victor was simply a parasite. I slowly raised the small black USB drive, letting the harsh tactical lights catch its edges. "Emily and my innocent grandson are my actual blood," I said, my voice dropping into a low, deadly gravel that easily cut through the chaotic noise of the crowded room. "You, Victor, are just a miserable parasite, who spent 6 long months actively digging his own grave inside my house. You deliberately burned your own home to ashes. You deeply traumatized my daughter. You brought violent monsters across my threshold. You falsely thought you could steal my legacy and leave me to rot in a federal cell. Have fun rotting in federal prison. I turned my back on him before he could utter another pathetic syllable. I did not want to hear his excuses. I did not want to look at his face ever again. The federal agents hauled him roughly to his feet, dragging him toward the ruined front entrance. His frantic cries echoed through the grand foyer, growing fainter and more desperate as they shoved him unceremoniously into the back of an armored transport vehicle. The heavy steel doors slammed shut permanently, sealing his fate. The piercing wail of the sirens began to fade as the convoy slowly rolled down the long, winding driveway, taking the darkness out of my home. I exhaled a long, heavy breath, feeling the intense adrenaline finally begin to recede from my tired muscles. David walked over to him, placing a strong, comforting hand on my shoulder. He told me the entire cartel node had been completely secured. The $50 million was successfully diverted and safely locked within the federal trap account. He assured me that the analog footage on my flash drive would guarantee Victor would never see the outside of a maximum security cell. The threat was entirely neutralized. We had won the war. But the most difficult battle was still waiting for me upstairs. I walked past the shattered glass and the ruined furniture, moving slowly toward the sweeping wooden staircase. I climbed the steps with a heavy heart. The explosive breach and the chaotic raid had undoubtedly awakened Emily. I reached the landing and saw her standing in the doorway of the master suite, clutching her infant son tightly to her chest. Her eyes were wide with shock, staring in disbelief at the smoke drifting down the hallway. She looked at the heavy revolver still resting by my side, and then she looked up at my face. She asked me what had happened, her voice trembling with confusion and fear. I holstered the weapon, stepping forward to wrap my arms protectively around her and my grandson. I held them close, feeling the fragile warmth of my real family. I knew the truth was going to break her heart. I knew that discovering her husband was a monster who had purposefully burned their home and orchestrated a cartel conspiracy would leave deep, lasting scars on her soul. But I also knew that she was strong. She was a Callahan. She would survive this betrayal, just as I had survived the attempt on my life. I kissed her forehead gently, whispering that she was safe now. I told her that the nightmare was completely over. I promised to explain everything when the sun came up. The house was finally quiet again, but it was no longer a silent tomb waiting for an execution. It was a formidable fortress that had successfully withstood a massive, devastating siege. I walked her back into her room, carefully ensuring she and the baby were completely secure. I locked the thick bedroom door. Then I returned slowly to my private study, pouring myself a heavy glass of aged scotch, completely ready to face the rising dawn. The invisible digital cage was permanently broken. My family was safe. My logistics legacy was entirely secure. The old gray wolf still firmly ruled his own territory. His tears were the final, pathetic offering of a man who had entirely run out of lies. The heavily armored federal agents hauled him roughly to his feet, completely ignoring his incoherent, frantic babbling. They marched him out through the shattered remains of my front doors, his expensive leather shoes dragging pathetically across the imported marble tiles. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers illuminated his pale, terrified face one last time before he was shoved forcefully into the back of an armored transport vehicle. The heavy steel doors slammed shut with a resounding metallic finality. That was the absolute last time Victor ever set foot on my property. The ensuing legal process was swift, brutal, and entirely devoid of mercy. My son David and his dedicated team of specialists at the Federal Bureau of Investigation meticulously dismantled the entire cartel network. The $50 million we had successfully diverted into the secure federal trap account provided the absolute undeniable proof they needed to immediately freeze hundreds of associated offshore assets. The ruthless cartel boss and his violent enforcers were securely locked away, facing multiple consecutive life sentences for for their extensive bloody criminal enterprise. But it was Victor who received the most crushing permanent blow. 2 weeks later, he stood in a sterile, brightly lit federal courtroom, entirely stripped of his tailored suits and his arrogant, polished executive smirk. He was wearing the bright, oversized orange jumpsuit of a federal inmate, his wrists bound in heavy iron chains. The federal prosecution did not hold back a single piece of evidence. They proudly presented the meticulous, high-definition analog video footage I had successfully recorded from the dark, hidden corners of my private study. They showed the presiding judge the exact, undeniable moment Victor forged my digital signature, proving beyond any reasonable shadow of a doubt that he had intentionally and maliciously hijacked my corporate identity. Furthermore, the crystal-clear audio recording from my basement directional microphone captured his chilling, remorseless directive to torture and murder me in cold blood. The judge looked down at Victor with pure disgust. He did not display a single ounce of leniency. Victor was formally and publicly sentenced to 35 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary for massive international money laundering and conspiracy to commit murder. There would be absolutely no early parole. There would be no clever digital loopholes or technical appeals. He was going to spend the rest of his natural life surrounded entirely by concrete steel and men far more dangerous than he ever pretended to be. Thanks to the overwhelming, insurmountable mountain of physical evidence and David's brilliantly orchestrated tactical sting operation, I was completely and unequivocally cleared of all criminal charges. The federal authorities officially recognized me as a critical, highly valuable asset who had bravely risked his own life to expose and destroy a massive criminal syndicate. My logistics empire remained entirely intact, its sterling reputation completely unblemished, safely resting back in my absolute control. I spent the following weeks working closely with my corporate attorneys, systematically purging every single line of automated code Victor had installed in my company servers. We rebuilt the digital infrastructure from the ground up, implementing rigid, old-fashioned verification protocols that strictly required physical human oversight. 2 months have passed since that terrifying, violent night. The shattered bay windows in the living room have been flawlessly replaced. The hardwood floors have been polished clean, and the heavy oak doors have been perfectly repaired. But the most significant lasting changes to the estate are the ones you can no longer see. I personally walked through every single room of this massive house with a heavy steel crowbar and a pair of industrial wire cutters. I violently and happily ripped out every single smart camera, every hidden wireless microphone, and every invasive motion sensor Victor had installed. I tore the thick bundles of internet cables from the drywall and threw the massive overheating server racks directly into a rented industrial dumpster. The oppressive invisible web of constant surveillance is completely gone. The house finally breathes again, returning to a state of quiet analog peace. I am currently sitting in my favorite wooden rocking chair on the wide back porch, letting the warm, golden afternoon sun wash over my face. A gentle breeze rustles through the old towering oak trees, carrying the sweet, familiar scent of blooming jasmine across the lawn. Through the open kitchen window, I can hear the comforting domestic sound of water boiling. Emily is inside, humming a quiet, cheerful tune as she prepares a hot pot of chamomile tea. She is safe. The dark, terrifying shadows that Victor had cast over her life are slowly beginning to fade. It will take time for her to fully heal from his profound, monstrous betrayal, but she is incredibly resilient. She is a Callahan, and she is finally free to build a life based on genuine truth rather than cold, calculated manipulation. Out on the manicured green grass of the sprawling backyard, my young grandson is happily chasing a brightly colored rubber ball. His innocent, joyful laughter rings out clearly through the crisp air, completely unburdened by the violence and greed that had briefly threatened to consume his entire world. I watch him stumble, playfully pick himself up and run again, his tiny legs moving with endless, boundless energy. I take a slow, deep sip of my hot black coffee, feeling the rich, bitter taste ground me perfectly in the present moment. I lean back in my wooden chair and close my eyes. My heart beats with a steady rhythmic drum of absolute certainty. The digital cage is permanently destroyed. The predators have been entirely eliminated. I am a man who successfully defended his territory against the worst kind of evil, and I have finally found absolute enduring peace. Age is often mistaken for vulnerability, but true wisdom comes from decades of surviving the harshest storms. As a father, your duty to protect your family does not end when your children grow up, it simply evolves. Sometimes the most dangerous threats do not break through your front door. They are invited in, hiding behind charming smiles and plausible lies. Never ignore your gut instincts, and never allow love to blind you to the cold, hard facts. Family is built on trust, respect, and mutual protection. When a parasite tries to use that love as a weapon, you owe it to your true bloodline to cut them out entirely. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button to support the channel. Subscribe now so you never miss another thrilling story. Let me know in the comments, what would you have done if you were in Richard's shoes? Tell me your city,